Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
Today on Decision Space, we're eating our veggies. This episode is a deep dive on the 2019 set collection drafting card game Point Salad. We're going to talk about flat out games, risk profiles, deck design, and more in this nutritional exploration of this zesty small box card game. Jake, are you excited for this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't like to eat their veggies? Am I right?
Yeah. I mean, I could really go for a salad exactly like the Point Salad salads, except not the ones where you just end up with onions. I'm not here for the onion cabbage salad.
The onion only salad?
Yeah.
I'm a little bougie in my salad preference. Like, give me like a shaved Brussels or like a warm beet salad. You know, that's kind of what I want in a salad if I'm like ordering it. If I'm at home, then I'll just do like a pre-made Caesar mix and that's good to go.
For the beets, are we adding goat cheese and nuts? Like walnuts or something?
I'm like generally a pretty wide open palate eater, but I do have like one weird thing, which is I really despise uncooked cheese.
Fascinating.
And goat cheese is like the worst. Like, yeah, okay, like cream cheese, like soft cheese, like a burrata I can get behind because that's like gooey enough. But like any kind of like hard cheese, I don't want it.
Like cheddar cheese on a sandwich.
I would rather have it without.
You'd rather have it without.
Yeah.
So diplomatic of you. What about grated cheese on pasta?
That's fine. I mean, that like melts, yeah. Like pizza
so a
all
little
day,
melting.
every day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, people are like, that's so weird, but like the whole taste profile changes dramatically. A melted cheese versus a non-melted cheese. Am I right?
Absolutely. And cheese is a divisive food. We live in a very cheese-centric culture in the United States. But I feel like, the rest of the world, there are places where cheese is considered to be a pretty funky thing to be into. So I think it's totally fair to only like cheese if its state has changed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, we should talk board games though. And we, on this episode, have we're covering the lightest game we've ever covered on the show, I think, right? This is lighter than Hey, That's My Fish and Jaipur. If not, it's right there.
It's in the same. Yeah, it's difficult to say. This is certainly at the low weight spectrum. And now I'm dying to know the weight on Board Game Geek and how it compares.
Yeah, you should look it up. And while you do, though, I will say that one thing that I'm struck by is the lightness of Point Salad. You almost don't need to read the rules to know how to play. The game is so intuitive once you know the sort of turn structure. But the decisions that it packs are rich and interesting. And there's enough going on within the sort of emergent play. There's no super deep emergence, certainly, but there's enough going on that there's some cool stuff to sort of pick up on. So Jake, do you want to lead us off on your initial thoughts and then we can kind of get into talking about the game, flat out games, the people who designed it, and all that?
Yeah. And believe it or not, Point Salad is almost a half point less weight than Jaipur and Hey, That's My Fish. So Point Salad comes in at 1.17. Hey, That My Fish is 1.45. Jaipur, heaviest of all, 1.47. So that's kind of surprising. But whatever. I am giving Point Salad a 5 out of 10. I think it's an average game. It doesn't really excite me, but it also doesn't overstay its welcome. Like there's not really much to not like about it. But I also just didn't find that much to like. It's almost like eating your veggies, But sometimes I don't wanna.
Great. Awesome. This is going to be a really good episode because for me, Point Salad is a crisp, rewarding, and fun risk management set collection game. It's maybe not a standout at higher player counts for me, but it's rock solid at 2 players, where its zero-sum nature makes for tense decisions and exciting moments. 8.5 out of 10. I really like Point Salad, especially at 2.
Well, should we just address the elephant in the room, which is that we played this game a dozen times with each other, and you won all 12.
I don't think
so. Maybe that's coloring perspectives here. I don't know. I don't think it is. I played some games without you that I managed to win, but let's just let the people know that had different experience in the win-loss column playing this game with each other. That maybe is coloring it slightly.
I think also I was compelled to keep playing and keep learning a little bit more than you maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I played this game a few times early on and was frustrated and sort of felt like, oh, this game, I don't get why I'm losing, but I am losing a lot. What am I doing wrong in terms of my decisions? And I could see how you would just sort of be like, I'll play something else. And I also want to caveat my score because my score would be higher if I was just rating the 2-player game and would be significantly lower if I was just rating sort of I don't want to play this game at 5 or 6 players really. I don't think. But the decision space that I like is so much tied into the zero sum 2-player decision space, which allows for sort of this passive hate drafting and really interesting like risk management that I think isn't present in a lot of games at this weight class. It's
Yeah.
fun.
Interestingly, on Board Game Geek, they have the game list as best at 3. Also, 45% of people think it's best at 4, and only 31% would said best at 2. So,
well, they're all wrong.
if you're listening to the wisdom of the crowd, it's a 3 to 4 player game.
I think there's valid criticism to be levied against myself, which I'm going to do currently, that maybe I've been approaching Point Salad a little bit from a try-hard perspective as wanting this to be an interesting 2-player game. And ultimately, this is intended to be sort of a light filler game where you could easily put it down on the table and play with 3 or 4 players. So
Yeah.
I get where the ratings are coming from, but it's so good at 2, Jake. It's so good
I
at
want
2.
to respond to you, but I think I should hold off because I think that gets into like a lot of the criticisms that I have about the game. Before we get into our deep dive, let's talk a little bit about this game's background.
Awesome. So Point Salad is published in 2019 by AEG and is designed by Flatout Games, which is a trio of a design collective of Molly Johnson, Robert Melvin, and Sean Stankiewicz. And Flatout Games, I think, Jake, that spent some time talking about Flatout Games, those 3 designers and the design collective around them, because I think from my perspective, I knew about Flatout Games coming to the show because they've published games like Cascadia and Calico. And then I knew they had designed some other games, but I didn't necessarily know sort of, okay, are they a publisher? Is it a design collective? What's going on here? So we'll sort of break that down in this section. Basically, it's this group of 3 people who are designing games. And oftentimes they will get those games published by other publishers like Point Salad, published by AEG, their game in 2020, Truffle Shuffle, also published by AEG, or they'll take on other people's designs and put their, I assume, development on them and also their presentation ethos and have those published. So, for example, Cascadia was a Flatout Games game that's designed by Randy Flynn but signed by Flatout Games. They took it to Kickstarter. It did really well. AEG then picked it up for distribution. Calico, a 2020 game from Flatout Games, is designed by Kevin Rush, but published by Flatout Games. Then you have other games from Flatout, like 10, the 2021 card game that was published by AEG, but again designed by Molly Johnson, Robert Melvin, and Sean Stankiewicz. So it's this interesting sort of collective of designers who are bringing a similar ethos to all the games that they touch, which I think is that the rule simplicity with interesting entwined decisions mostly covers it.
So it looks like perhaps this group started out as designers and now are moving more into the publishing space after their success with Cascadia, which I think will be how the vast majority of people who know Flatout Games or have been exposed to their games probably know them, since that game, as we talked about, was like arguably the biggest game of 2021 from a hobby board game perspective.
Winning the Spiel des Jahres, yeah, absolutely. And then they have, so in 2023, speaking to Jake, maybe them emphasizing publishing a little bit more, they're going to be publishing a game called Fit to Print, which is a real-time game where players are, they have objectives around certain stories, and they have to lay out a newspaper with things above the fold and below the fold. And that game is designed by Peter McPherson, who is the designer of Tiny Towns, which is an AEG published game. So sort of they're very AEG adjacent, it's clearly a strong relationship there, but I think they are their own collective, despite doing a lot of things with AEG.
Yeah, definitely a design collective publisher that I think a lot of people are keeping their eye on, even if at this point they're still a little more fledgling than some of the biggest publishing names in our hobby.
But very hot right now, for sure. I think
Definitely.
that anytime something's coming out from Flatout, people are looking at it because all these games sort of share really strong presentation, simple rule set, a lot of drafting with interesting entwined decisions. I would say that's almost a hallmark, and we see that here in Point Salad too. So I just wanted to, in this episode at the top, give people a little bit of a primer. And yeah, kudos to Molly, Nathan, and Sean for all of the amazing work that they've done so far. It's really impressive to see how many designs have come out of this team, even in the last 5 years. That's a really impressive ludology for such a small time period.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's get into your very short rules overview for Point Salad. And for once, we will teach you exactly everything you need to know to play this game. And then we'll get into our decision space deep dive on the other side.
Point Salad is a drafting set collection card game for 2 to 6 players. Cards in Point Salad are double-sided, with one side depicting one of 6 types of veggies: carrots, peppers, cabbage, tomatoes, lettuce, and onions. The reverse-sided cards in Point Salad depict a scoring condition. For example, one card might say cabbages are worth 2 points each, or if you have the fewest tomatoes at the end of the game, gain 7 points. In the center of the table are 6 veggie cards laid out in a 2x3 grid with 3 scoring objectives above them. The objective side of the cards also depicts the veggie that is on the reverse side. Each turn, players have a simple decision. They may either draft 2 veggie cards or take 1 scoring objective. If they draft 2 veggie cards, the current scoring objectives corresponding to the column that the veggies were taken from are flipped down into the grid with their veggie side up. Alternatively, players may take 1 scoring objective. Then at the end of each turn, players may flip 1 scoring objective of those that they've drafted previously, permanently turning it to its veggie side. Scoring objectives stack, allowing players to craft unique scoring positions that range from a true generalist who wants all types of veggies to a true specialist who wants a specific vegetable type and has opted into negative scoring conditions for other veggie types. Once all the cards in the game have been drafted, the player with the most points is crowned the victor.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Hopefully, if you have to teach Point Salad at your next game night, you can just queue up this podcast audio to that point, and Brendan's done your job for you, explaining everything you need to know to break out and play this little tiny card game.
I hope so. Though if you need to put the deck together, definitely reference the rulebook, because I didn't get into that fact that we do have a deck that's adjusting in size based on player count. So I guess natural to say that now. But Jake, okay, are we staying positive at the start, or is this just going to be a straight
I'm a
back
positive
and forth?
guy.
Yeah, most of the time. Let's start how we always start, with talking about the decision space overall, clarity, feel, that sort of thing.
Sure.
So this is it's sort of interesting, but ultimately it's a waning decision space game. There's only so many vegetables of each type, and the game ends when all of the cards have run out. So I don't think, though, that it has that tension so much around a waning feel that you have in a lot of games until you come to know the quantities and the number of vegetables to be looking out for of these different types, right? You can play this on sort of the first level is just sort of, I'm taking cards, I'm not thinking too much about what I'm doing, and it doesn't feel like a waiting decision space. But the second you sort of say, okay, what is the actual, what is the makeup of the deck? All of a sudden, I think that actually comes to the forefront, and you're really carefully looking at what cards could come up and making very strong tactical decisions, even around, do I take 2 cards of the same column or the same row to flip these objectives in certain ways, and what objectives could still be out based on what I know. And then it wanes and it hurts.
Is it true that there's just one of each objective in the deck?
Yes, that is true.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes sense. I think that's really interesting, because I was going to push back on what you were saying at first and say, like, no, Brenda, this is clearly a static decision space. Like, you just always have the same options available to you on every single turn of the game, pending possibly the last turn or last 2 turns where you might not be able to select a point card and will be taking just vegetables instead. And to me, that doesn't feel waning. That feels like as static gets. But I do take your point that, if you are familiar with the goals, right, and are playing to the possibility of specific goals coming up, and then those goals are no longer available to you because you saw them get discarded or somebody else took them, then in some ways that does change your thinking, of course, right? It sort of shrinks what you know is available to you. But I'm not sure, like, do you think that actually impacts the decision space available to you on any given turn? Like, it changes your objectives and like which cards you may take, but I feel like you still have like the decision space of deciding which vegetable cards or single point card you're going to take stays the same. You just are privy to more specific information.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point, though. I guess where I would push back is when we move into the sort of meaningful decisions aspect of the game. I think that your meaningful decision space really shifts based on what cards have come out, what probabilities exist based on the allocation of vegetables. But I think that your point, Jake, about you're making either you're making one of two decisions to either draft two vegetables or take an objective, and then you're making an added decision of you could flip a card, all flip an objective card that you've previously drafted is really fair. The game, I think, in terms of that structure, does feel kind of similar to a very static game where you're making the same decisions over and over again. But then layered on top of this is also that I am changing my incentives,
Mhm.
right? If I draft a bunch of objectives cards up front, I've shifted my decision space in terms of what I could be
Right.
doing and what is meaningful. So I think this game, there's more going on. It's a little bit harder to categorize than maybe it would seem.
So you're saying that like while you still have the six different vegetable cards to pick from because you know that a certain goal is gone or you've taken a certain goal, instead of now deciding between all of those vegetables, like your subjective decision space for you has changed and shrunk because now you're no longer going to take any tomatoes if you can avoid it.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying.
But I would push back on that because I think that your decision space there ebbs and flows over the course of the game, right? Like if you start out and you have just taken one point card that rewards you for taking cabbage and tomato, right? You get a pair of those and you get 5 points, then you may be just wanting to take those if a cabbage and tomato is like available to you, and then when it's not, you start branching into other things. And then that kind of creates like a growing of the types of vegetable cards you're interested in.
So are you making the argument that this is actually a dynamic decision space, Jake?
No, I'm still stick. I think I'm leaning. At first, I was agreeing with you because of your experience, but now I think I'm leaning back to the fact that I think like it's like for me, I'll just say like 12 plays in or whatever I'm at, not as many as you. Like the overwhelming feel I get playing this game is static decision
Mm.
space. Like I am doing the same thing on every turn, and this is said without like this is not a criticism. Like I think there's a lot of great static decision space games, so that doesn't mean there's not like a lot going on or a lot of intrigue within those decisions, but just like you essentially are presented with the same choice on every single turn of the game from turn one to X minus one or whatever. Um, and I think like your subjective decision space within that might ebb and flow slightly in how you're prioritizing cards. But to me, that doesn't, yeah, it doesn't change enough or in a linear fashion that we might think with like a waxing or waning game.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I think we get into this like difficult thing, right? Where we talked about subsequent of doing our waning decision space game, where it's like every game is a waning decision space game. Cause like, yes, cards are running out, like your like options that were potentially available to you at the start of the game are no longer available to you, or maybe like less likely to pop up because you're getting close to the end of the game and you haven't seen the goal. But to me, like the general thrust, like the most important things that impact the decision space for the bulk of the game are very static.
I think the structure is certainly static. I agree with
Okay.
you there. But from a decision space perspective, just in terms of what your incentives are and what you can do around that, to me, that doesn't feel static at all, right? Because I'm drafting certain objective cards and that's changing my decisions around what's viable. And then the longer the game goes on, the more information about what veggies remain that I have, the the more my outs in terms of my ability to score have waned. Like what becomes a viable path forward at a given point, that's where I feel the tension that reminds me of a lot of the waning decision-based games that we've played. And maybe we're not going to, I think we're right now injecting what is this like larger meta conversation that we're having about this lens that we've created and been thinking about for the almost 2 years now into this conversation. And it behooves us probably to move on in terms of our point salad episode, but keep either return to this on another episode and like really interrogate what we're saying, because I think we might be like moving our definition slightly to accommodate these different perspectives, and we should like hammer it down and think more and say like, is this lens helping us understand decision spaces better, or has it run its course,
Yeah. No, yeah, that makes sense. Like in the context of this game too, I'm struck by what you just said. Like it feels like the different strategic paths through this game also impact the way the decision space is going to feel in a really
Yeah,
interesting way, right? Like
definitely.
because there's sort of three different paths as I see it. Maybe you'll disagree. I'd be interested to hear. But you could sort of bulk up on vegetable cards early on, right? And get ones that you think are going to, you know, basically give yourself a strong base so that you'll be able to take many different points cards that will be profitable to you towards the end. Or you could go, so that's kind of a broad strategy. Or you could go for a more vertical strategy, right? Where you maybe are honing in on specific point cards early on in the game and trying to bulk up on like those vegetables, right? So you're sort of starting with the goal and then trying to cultivate your salad to fit that. Or the third is something in between, right? Where you're sort of getting point cards and vegetable cards in equal part. And I think that the decision space that you have available to you on your turn is a little bit different and maybe has a different sort of shape and dynamic to it depending on where you go.
Definitely. So I view Point Salad as a game about creating. It's almost, this game is, out of so many games that we've played, to me feels more like building a portfolio, and it's around speculating around what's going to come up in the market, right? So if you're drafting objectives, my goal when I start a game of Point Salad, the two things I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get synergies between objectives, right? That's like number one. If I can get the two, there's a flavor of objectives in this game that is get these three different types of veggies, and then you get 8 points. And if I can get two of those cards that overlap in two of the veggies, that's like my favorite opening ever, right? Because it's flexible. I have no downside risk. You can, in Point Salad, there's objectives designed around downside risk where you get a huge payoff for a certain type of vegetable. For example, you might get 4 points for a lettuce, which is very, very high. Or, sorry, maybe you'll get 3 points for a tomato, but you'll lose 2 points for a lettuce. So now tomatoes are great for you, but lettuce is bad for you. So my way of playing this game is almost always to try to avoid those hyper specialized cards, because I feel like you expose yourself to too much risk. Just like how I don't typically prefer to play the version of this game where you draft veggies first and then you try to find the objectives that fit them, because I feel like I have less control and agency, and I'm not staying as open to what happens within the cards as they come out. And drafting games, the making strong decisions in drafting games are almost always about staying as open as possible so that you can play the game, not let the game play you.
I think that is well said, but I think like drafting the veggies early, it makes you open in a different way, right? You're just open to the goals instead of being open to different vegetables. So I just played a game that just where I sort of tried out this strategy and ended with like a really high score. I was playing a 3-player game. It felt like my two opponents were going heavy on goal cards early. I do think maybe we'll talk about some of the gold cards, but it seems to me like some are stronger than others. The ones you indicated in particular feel quite strong, where you can get the 8 points for three different vegetables. So on my turn, like at the start of the game, just those weren't coming up. So I just thought, okay, well, I'm just going to keep taking pairs of vegetables and just see how that works out. And then towards the end of the game, people were scrambling to get cards, and I just took like 5-point cards in a row to basically end the game and end up winning with a pretty high score. So I think that is certainly viable, like as a path too.
I definitely think that there's a timing consideration around the strategy that you beat in that game, right? I'll take these objectives early and then I'll build around the objectives that I've taken. You can misplay that by taking too many objectives early on, right? in some ways, if you wait, and if I draft a bunch of objectives around carrots and I just keep taking objectives around carrots,
Right.
my greed will destroy me, because you'll just take the carrots. And in a 2-player game, for example, there's only 6 carrots in the game. So if I'm snatching up all the carrot cards, and Jake over here, it, because of the zero sum nature of it being 2-player, if you get even one scoring card for carrots, but you have all the carrots, you're doing way better than me if I've wasted all that time taking them. But I think on average, because the game allows you to stack synergies, right? Like, so much of the scoring is about finding the objectives that overlap each other a little bit, so you can make every one of your cards count extra. Like, it's way more powerful to take 1 tomato if that 1 tomato is scoring off 4 of your cards, than if you draft early on, you take a bunch of cabbages and you get 1 card that cares about the cabbages for 2 points each or something.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that the risk of taking all the veggies early on is that you don't get the overlaid synergies. And the risk of going early is you don't get the veggies you need. And that puzzle is there for sure. The final point I'll make about why I like the staying open, taking objectives early, I'm not saying take all your objectives, just some, is that you can always go from objective to veggie, but you can't go from veggie to objective, right? With the flip. The flip at the end of a turn. So I think that little bit incentivizes you to maybe start a little more conservatively, and you leave certain paths open by taking more objectives. You see what comes. And then if you need to flip one of your objectives, you shouldn't do that too often. It's a huge tempo hit to you in terms of cards you're getting. And the more cards you get in this game, typically the more you're going to score, just because you got more, but not always, because having the right cards matters more. But if you take objectives early, see, this game's good. There's a lot going on here. If you take objectives early, you have more flexibility in terms of what you can do, because you can flip later on once a certain path closes. So you can use that flipping mechanism as a hedge to protect yourself from certain things not coming up, or not coming up at the right time, right? There is randomness in this game. Sometimes I just never get a chance to draft the cabbages that I need because of the way that they're flipping, or I just have to draft them from objectives and then flip them.
Yeah. Do you think there's like a number of objectives? Like, what is the band of viable objective total cards that you need at the end of the game? Like, what's the least amount of objectives you can win with, and what's the most that you've seen?
That's a really good question. I've seen it depends, but I think that in general, depending on the objectives that you have, you could win this game with 3 objectives, right? If you get the objective that's the one that's the ultimate salad, where you get one of each veggie counts for 12. If you have a set of all 6, you get 12 points. And then if you get the card that says that you get, I think it's 3 points for every veggie
Everyone you have 2 of. Yeah.
If you can stack those 2, that's a really powerful combination, right? Because if you double up on veggies, that's 24 points from that first card, and then it's 18 points from the second. So that gets you to, you're in the low 40s there. Add one more card that is maybe a set of 3, and all of a sudden you're in the money. You're like in that 50 to 60 range. My range of scores typically goes from like 40 to 60 against people who are strong opponents. Sometimes you can have even higher scores if you just don't get in each other's way. And then I think to ask the other question is, I think you can go really wide. I've seen scores games where maybe you have 7, 8 objectives. I'd have to look, but does that sound right to you, Jake?
Yeah, it does. And I think the reason I asked that with the sort of the timing puzzle of it, as you indicate, it's like you can start with objectives first, but you sort of can't do too many. Like, I think it's helpful to know like what a reasonable number that you're shooting for is. And that might not be totally intuitive the first go around, which is fine, right? Because the game takes 10 minutes to play or whatever. But it seems like the way the games typically go for me is that like me and the other players have between, I would say like 5 and 6 is like by far the most common number of goals. It feels like the game is sort of pushing you in that direction a little bit.
I think, just you're talking about a 2-player and 3-player too. I guess I haven't looked at the way the cards break down by player count, but yeah.
Yeah, I've only played a 2 and 3 player, so I don't know about higher than that, but you're just adding more cards in, right? So you have like the same number of cards, roughly, I would imagine.
I imagine. I haven't done the math.
So I think you'll end up roughly with the same number of cards, so it probably doesn't impact it too much.
On Board Game Geek, or on BGA, Jake, the average for final point cards is 4.57, and the
Okay.
winner's average is 4.66. I do think that the band there, that's an average, right? It's not a median. So I
Mhm.
think that there is a lot of room on either side, but it's kind of like right in line with that, like 4 to
Yeah. So
5.
4 to 5 more so
Yeah.
than 5 to 6.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. All right. When should we get into the stuff that sucks about this game?
Well, that's
Just kidding.
oh my gosh, eviscerated. See, this is why we know it's a review of a salad, because Jake has strong feelings. Let's talk. Can we talk first, Jake, about the sort of this idea of bound and unbound card games?
Okay. Yes.
So this idea of bound and unbound card games is one that I saw on Twitter from the designer of another small box card game, Air, Land, and Sea, John Perry. This is language that we're borrowing from him. I don't know that this is my favorite language for this term, but I really want to talk about the concepts, which are something that I've thought a lot about as a card game designer. And here's the general idea, right? There's these two types of card games that exist. There's card games where you know the probabilities and it's designed such that players of the game can have an intuitive sense of the probabilities around certain cards being drawn. So poker is a game design is a completely it is designed to be a bound
Right.
game. You know
You have.
what's in that deck, and the whole game is about trying to assess probabilities. Magic the Gathering sealed is on the other end of the spectrum, or even Magic the Gathering in general. There's 20,000 cards in the card pool. If your friend just rolls up with a deck that they made, you're each going to build a deck from your collection. That's the other side of the spectrum. Who knows what's in their deck of cards, right? Completely unknown probabilities.
Although, interestingly, competitive Magic the Gathering probably fits closer to Bound, right? Like, you
Right.
know that they have almost assuredly like 4 copies of this important card in their deck, and you've seen 2 of them.
Yeah. No, exactly. That is interesting. That the design around competitive Magic
Mhm.
moved it in that direction. But and then on the show, Jake, in the past, we've talked about how sometimes if a game kind of sits between these two poles a little bit too much, it can be really frustrating. So in our discussion of Evolution, the card drafting game, we talked about how that deck it was sometimes really difficult just based on the number of certain copies of cards to know what your chances were of being able to pursue certain strategies. So it
Mhm.
kind of lived between an unbound and bound game in a way that was frustrating as a player. And I think that one interesting thing about Point Salad is it kind of tries to be both. The vegetables are bound. You know that at any given player count, there's a set number of each. At 2 player, there's 6 veggies of each type. But
There's
then the
always
score
going to be an equal number of all vegetables
of all
too.
vegetables.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then the scoring objectives, those change based on the player count, right? And the design of them, you know, they are designed to be equal, to be fairly even. It doesn't feel like any vegetable is penalized more than any other. It doesn't feel that way. But it's hard to sort of say, will this scoring objective come up? The one I specifically want, that's a much more difficult thing. You're not thinking about that in terms of your decisions as much. So Point Salads becomes this interesting hybrid game between these sort of bound probability games and these sort of unbound probability card games. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's a cool idea and something to think about card games as you try to put them into one of these two buckets. And the decision spaces certainly feel different, right? Like the type of thinking that I'm doing when I'm engaging with the vegetable part of this puzzle is different than when I'm engaging with the objective part of this puzzle. And I think that for me is part of why I rate this game higher, is it's letting me hang out in the two different types of card game playgrounds that I like and enjoy both of them for their own separate reasons, all at the same time because of the multi-use cards.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is very well said. I hadn't really thought about bound versus unbound, and I think that's a really interesting characterization, a lens that we can use going forward. I think that's one of the things that we both really admired about the Welcome to Flip and Right game, right? Where it's like you're playing with cards, but even if you don't know the count of the cards, you can like very intuitively understand that the 12s and the ones are going to be less common than the 6s and 7s or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting kind of case for that as well. I think I struggle with the idea of bound. Uh, like it, I guess like I think that is one of the things that like frustrates me about this game, which this will be one criticism I'll get into now just because it's relevant, which is like it does feel like you want to know what goals are
Mm.
possible. And I think there's some sense of like boundness in that. Like I assume there's a goal for like every set of 3 vegetables, probably. And maybe all the pairs, but maybe not, right? And I think like almost like even if there are, like I don't know that, right? And I'm not gonna like dig into trying to learn that about the card pool either, because I'm not interested in like necessarily like trying to get super duper good at this game. I think it's just not quite like compelling enough on its own for me. So that felt like when you were beating me over and over again, I'm just like, is that thought is definitely coming in my head. Like, does he know what goals are likely to come out in a way that I don't yet? And I think that was like a little bit frustrating.
I think that that could also, Jake, explain why I like to play this game, opting into some goals, 2 to 3 goals early on that are synergistic, and
Hmm.
then pushing on that pedal as hard as I can, maybe picking up 2, 3, 4 more along the way, because it minimizes that baggage. And no, I don't, even if you ask me, like, I don't have perfect knowledge of all the three sets, which are
Hmm.
really valuable cards. I could have studied it, but I didn't. That's not. It doesn't sound fun to me. I don't want to sit there and study
Yeah.
the scoring objective manifest of this game, and I don't think that you need to be strong at it. Though it would make the other strategy more viable, right? If I'm going to try to build around these 2 outs, it would certainly behoove me to know what the 3 sets that I could overlap with were in terms of those outs. And maybe that strategy would get a little bit better for me. But I think there's a lot of randomness in terms of if someone drafts 2 of the same column, all of a sudden you have a scoring
Right.
objective that you never get to see that just gets flipped to a veggie. So you're just exposed to a lot of risk playing that in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I think like, you know, and maybe that's like not a fully rational thought, but it's definitely like a feeling that I experienced playing this game where it's like it would help to know this and I can't be bothered to.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah.
Though I do like, Jake, that the game leaves you room to minimize that impacting you because
Yeah.
it,
No,
it
that's a
is a
great
viable
point.
strategy to take them up front, take too many and then flip some. And I I like so games like Lost Cities we covered on the show. The card action economy is always the same. In that game, you are playing a card and then you're swapping a card, right? The number of cards in your hand is never changing. There's no hand in this game, but you're
Right.
always having this economy of one card coming in, one card going out. Well, that's not necessarily true because you could be playing it to your scoring side or playing it to the board, but you get what I'm saying in terms of
Hmm.
actions. And I like how in Point Salad, you're making a decision of to take a half card turn or a 2 card turn. And what those
Right.
cards do are really different. And the value of them is unknown because it's dependent on your scoring objectives. But that adds a lot of texture to the game around efficiency of turns in a way that to me is the fun puzzle I'm always trying to solve with playing Point Salad.
I think that's like point salad at its best for sure. Is
Mm.
making those choices in that way on your turn. But I think also on the more negative side of that is there's so much like known information that I feel like the
Mm.
game is easy to add up and but like I can't be bothered to, which is like how much is a tomato worth to Brendan right now? And I like look over at his board and you have like 6 objectives. Okay, he has a tomato and lettuce and carrot goal that scores 8 points. So how much does he have like an extra lettuce and carrot also? And then, okay, and now like let me check into cabbage next. You know what I mean? And I think like you definitely don't have to play this game that way, but I think especially at 2 players, which is how I played the bulk of my plays, like the zero sum nature of that makes it like you probably should be doing that to be giving it like your honest best effort.
Hmm.
Where I think that matters a lot less in 3 and 4 player game, which is why maybe it's going to be a better experience for me to play at those player counts because like then I don't have to care so much about like what I'm leaving on the board for you because potentially the next player or the player after them is just going to take that anyway. But I think just like that, like in the mental arithmetic that is present at all times if you want to do it was not something that I found like compelling.
I feel like for me, before the arithmetic part, so my flowchart of decisions, the first thing that I am looking at, right, is what's best for me. Then I'm looking at what's going to hurt Jake the most. And typically when that happens, you'll have a hole in a set you're trying to collect. I'm not as worried as this is a +1 for you or this is a +2, unless you've stacked up where tomatoes are a +6 points for you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's really easy because for the rest of the game, I know I'm not giving Jake a tomato. I can't give him 6-point tomatoes. But outside of that scenario, let's say you have a few of those. I'm trying to collect sets. Are there any things overlapping and what are you missing? Oh, Jake is trying to collect carrots, lettuce, and onions. He has 3 carrots and 3 lettuce. For the next however many turns, my objective is I'm now in the onion business and I love onions, right? Because if I can deny you those, I've denied you the possibility of getting those 16 points. And for me, the agency around the decisions, because of the information, I said this in the rules overview, but I want to emphasize it now. When the scoring objectives are up at the top of the grid, they show you what vegetables on the back. And you
Yeah.
know that those objectives are going to flip down into vegetables that people can draft. So in a 2-player game, it feels to me like this really like slow-mo, like almost Matrix style fight where you're like
Yeah, I can see
carefully
that.
choosing every action around what you know the other player wants. And I like the agency that comes with that. And for me, that's why this game doesn't raise to a 9 or even higher. I think it almost does so perfectly what it's trying to do. And it 2-player captures it so well, but I lose so much agency in 3 and 4 players. And it becomes more of a, I hope I luck into what I need. And it becomes more of, what are other people not going for? And can I go for that? Right? Like
Mhm.
what's just going to be left on the table?
No, that makes sense. I was going to say, I think that, sorry to cut you off, but I think that also opens up the more vegetable first strategy too, right? Where it's like if you're load up on a couple objectives early, then there's a lot more people around the table that can sort of scoop up those vegetables from you than just one single person. So I don't know, food for thought.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I find because I don't have perfect information of the objective side, right? That's the unbound part of the game. For in terms of decision spaces, I would rather play in the version where you take objectives first rather than take veggies first, because I get to make more interesting decisions around taking veggies versus taking scoring objectives. Then okay, I'm going to take a bunch of veggies, then hope I draw into the objectives. So maybe that's my bias as a player too. Like maybe if the other version was better mechanically within the game, which I'm not convinced it is, but maybe if it was, I would still have a bias for the first person
Mhm.
because I have more fun making those types of decisions. I
Yeah,
don't know.
that makes
Just
sense.
a little thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that the point cards show the vegetable on the back, right? Because that's super important for the flipping mechanism,
Yes.
which I think this
So
game
yeah.
definitely needs to have. But I think that all like exacerbates the my frustration with the arithmetic portion of it, right?
Yeah.
Because you can like see that. Where I like wish you couldn't see it for the flop. I think that would streamline decisions a little bit easier. And you disagree?
Because that would lean into the problem with the game, right? Players who have a better knowledge of the card backs of scoring objectives, like then I
Oh
could
yeah,
go
I didn't. I
study the
wasn't thinking about
manifest.
that. I
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
thinking about that. Yeah.
And then on top of it, one of my favorite
Okay, I retract that statement.
one of my favorite decisions in the game is around, I think that you end up in these sort of nuanced positions where you're trying to craft a certain board state, right? So the objectives that you could take early on that really reward you for one type but give you a negative. So what it means to have negative scoring conditions means that you have an exploitable position that, so if you've stacked up these things that give every time you take a tomato, you lose 4 points.
Yeah,
So
that'd be
great.
pretty bad.
It would be pretty bad. And there's times where it kind of makes sense, but there's
Right,
also times where tomatoes don't come up early. And as your
right.
opponent, I'm just like, oh, hands off the tomatoes. The final 6, if I can make a board of 6 tomatoes and force Jake to take at least 3 of them, he's losing 12 points. I like the decisions around drafting and trying to craft the board where maybe I take 2 horizontal because I know exactly what the next board state will be, right? I take the lettuce and the cabbage that are next to each other in the grid because I know that a carrot and a lettuce will flip into their place. Or maybe I
Mhm.
really need these. I don't like any of my options in terms of taking 2 horizontal cards because I don't want either of the cards that I know would flip to flip. So I'm going to take the riskier path and I'm going to take 2 in the same column. That flips 1 known card, which maybe it's bad, it's an onion, but I hope that it flips 1 good one for me or something like that. I
Yeah,
think those decisions are fun because it's not I can't do the math there, right? Like I don't know what the other card will be, so I can't
But you
math it
can't do
out
the math in
perfectly
that one
in
specific
that one
case where
specific
you
case.
take two out of the same column and you don't know one single card. You
Yes.
still know one, and then any other combination of vegetables, you know exactly what's going to flip.
Yes.
So I would
That's true.
say, so I would say to me that doesn't like negate the fact that like it still comes down to like I just feel like the person who's like willing to sit there and like do the most arithmetic, and that's less a problem in a two-player game maybe in some sense because like I guess both players can do it like relatively easily, but like I don't like that, okay, every time I want to take these vegetables because like I want them. They fit with my strategy, whatever I'm trying to cultivate. But like if there's so say there's like I need a lettuce and there's a lettuce in the middle and the left row. Now I have to like look at the two cards that are gonna flip and like look at like everybody else's like objective around the table to see like who needs what and like what is better for them. Like to me that's not any kind of a skill intensive decision at all.
It's
It's just
busy
like,
work.
are you willing to do the arithmetic necessary to do that? And I feel like that is a frustration that's present on like every turn of the game.
And I feel like I can play the first 3/4 of the game mostly playing off. I'm going to glance at what Jake needs. I'm going to, get a sense
Mm-hmm.
for it, play my instincts. And then the last third of the game, oh, it's on. Calculator
Yeah,
comes out. And
right.
I will say the pacing around that can be frustrating. We talked about this early on with some of the members in the Discord where the final parts of the game can be a little anticlimactic, where if certain vegetables, people have moved into positions where they need certain veggies to not come up and then those come up, it can leave you with a pretty anticlimactic ending. But the flip side is if you can have the opposite scenario where the end game is really fun and tactical, where if I've drafted a few too many objectives, I don't get exactly what I need for them, but I can flip this objective into something that gives me, 16 points on one flip because I'm fulfilling two criteria of sets. That's really fun.
Yeah. Also, you could get I think like for me, the worst anticlimactic ending is like the last point card flips and it's like, oh, wow, I can take that. And it just gifts me, 15 points or whatever because I already have these conditions filled. And like that to me feels really unsatisfying.
Mm,
And I think like I'm obviously like sharing a lot of criticisms, like frustrations I found in this game, and like they are all so slight because the game is so small.
yeah.
Like that would be a lot more frustrating in like a longer game. But like it's short, whatever. Hooray! I got what I wanted and I win. That's fine. Like these are all like very small criticisms, and I don't think like should put anyone off from like trying the game, especially because it's available on Board Game Arena. But yeah, I think like that sort of like potential to sort of like it feels like whatever happens at the end has like an outsized impact because there's no way to like respond to it, even if it has the same impact as getting a objective that's good for you at the halfway point in the game.
I
It
think that
feels worse.
But I think what's really interesting from a decision space perspective about around what you're saying and design is that because of the unboundness of the objectives, when you draw into something late game, it's not rewarding because you don't feel you've earned it. And I think in terms of this episode, that's such an important takeaway for me in terms of when I'm designing games or when anyone's in thinking about games, right? If you took that consideration and you flipped it, I think if you knew what the conditions you could draw into and you got it, you had perfectly positioned yourself. I think that'd be a huge winning moment. You'd feel
Yeah.
amazing. You would feel like the smartest salad eater at the table all night long. But because of that element of the game being unbound, you're just like, oh, okay, I YOLO'd into it. And that matters and that's interesting and important. And I love that we get to glean that takeaway from this episode. And it's like
Yeah.
simple, but
Yeah,
that's
it's
what it
interesting.
is.
And some people who have like mastered this game for whatever reason will feel rewarded because they're like, yes, I knew that
Yeah.
card was one of the possible goals and I hadn't seen it yet and I've been like meticulously trying to memorize. This game has a huge memory component to it, I would say, which is another kind of criticism trying to get in there at the end, which again, personal preference, but like the game really rewards being able to like memorize what objectives you've seen and haven't seen yet, which I think is some people like, some people are not going to like. So even in this game's current form as it exists now, somebody getting a goal that helps them at the end of the game might feel very earned and be very earned. But I think like to get there, it just like requires a sort of investment of time and energy that I'd almost like rather people not be making. Like that time and energy investment doesn't fit the magic circle that I want for a game like this, right? I think I would be much happier playing it very quickly, you know, with a table of 3 or 4 people, maybe.
Yeah. And I think maybe that fits the design aesthetic that it was going for a little bit more. And I think that in that case, there a lot of the things I love about the game are de-emphasized. But I will say, Jake, to sort of follow up on what you were saying, one of the reasons why I love this game is when I first played it, I found it really frustrating.
Hmm.
And then a little bit of effort, I learned so much about the symptoms, and I got an immediate reward. My second, my 10 to 20 plays, I was so much better at the game than my 1 to 10 plays in a way that felt really palpable in terms of the decisions that I was making that made it fun. The heuristics that I could learn and the little things that I gleaned about the system paid off immediately, and that felt great. But I don't need to I got to the top 50 on Board Game Arena, and I was there for a little bit, and that was enough. Like I
Legend.
don't want to shoot for top 10 in this game because there's enough there that
Wait, I've been just
investing.
losing to a top 50 point salad guy this whole
No.
time.
Who knows how big the player base is even? But what I'm saying is that like it was really fun getting good-ish at the game, but I don't think there's enough here that I want to compete for first, right? Like that
Yeah.
doesn't sound fun.
It's so interesting because like yeah, like I don't know why like this just comes to my own personal bias, but like why is it any like less cool for somebody to get really good at point salad than somebody to like spend a lot of time to get like really good at Agricola? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But at the same time, like in my head, I'm holding those things in like very different like esteem. Like, oh, you try hard point salad person, like let's play this game. Whereas like in Agricola, it's like, oh no, like this is like this game that deserves study and should be a competitive experience. And anybody who doesn't want that, you're wrong, Like it's just, it's interesting.
I think that a lot of that is about the historical perception of weight of games. Maybe that goes all the way back to the way that chess was viewed as an intellectual game.
Yeah.
And the structure of a game with low randomness like Agricola versus a game with high randomness like Point Salad, and how culturally we've inherited a lot of these perceptions, even if they don't necessarily go along with what we in modern day think of games as. I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't want to be like, as I say that, and I'm poking fun at myself. I am struck by like that mindset is very like gatekeepery in a sense. Like, why should like being really good at memory, right, and having like practicing like that skill set be like less valued than whatever type of strategic thinking that it requires you to do well in Agricola, right? And I
Sure.
feel like in Agricola, what it really rewards is like pre-study and thought in the same way, right? Like
Yeah.
knowing what's going to come out, knowing what, objectives and stuff go good together, so on and so forth. And like that I'm totally here for. But like, oh, you're just better at memorizing the goals than me, and therefore like this game frustrates me. That's kind of where I'm at with this one.
The flip side is you were willing to get really good at Castles of Burgundy, but that's a
Right.
game with completely bound information in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Like
I think it just comes to preference, right? It's just
it's
player
preference.
preference.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I think it's also so interesting that in some ways, Jake, like you came down on, I like this game, but I don't love it. I'll play it with 3 or 4 players. It's fun as a filler game. And then I tackled it more as I'm not super interested in playing this as a 3 or 4 player filler game, but as a 2 player tactical battle, great. But again, we're back to preference because I have an affection for really tactical 2 player games that are zero sum, and
Yeah.
I think they're fun.
Yeah, and I'm not really typically as much in that camp. And you can't say anything, but it's like a win for this game that like it can appeal to both types of people in different
Yeah.
settings, right? Like that's
Yeah.
just more value out of this box. That does certainly pack a lot of value in a small price point, to say nothing of like, it's a very, accessible, like you could use this to teach people all about drafting. It's approachable, has like cute art and so on. Like all those things are definitely huge benefits to this game that we don't typically talk about with our decision space lens. So
Yeah.
I think credit to its due. I don't want to come off as super like dismissive of people enjoying this. And I do think it's interesting too, like the returning to the beginning of the conversation, we look at like the board game geek preference of this. We got 203 total voters. Of those, 75 said best at 4, 79 said best at 3, and 54 said best at 2. And it's interesting because like this game is so different at 4 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yeah.
I think that's cool.
I think that that's also so much a comment on the context in which we play games impacts how we feel about them, which is important for us to remember just in general with the show, right? Like the games that our friends are willing to play with us probably impacts what games we enjoy to some
Yeah.
extent, at the very least. Like if I'm only able to play 3 and 4 player games for the most part, I probably end up enjoying Point Salad more at those player counts because I'm more used to playing games at that way. And I actually am someone who mostly plays games at 2. And what do you know? I like Point Salad at 2.
Yeah, and have been practicing and honing those sort of zero sum tactical card game skill set in a way I haven't. So probably you're just intuiting and synthesizing a lot of these things that I'm having to think about, right? Like when you're saying like I'm going with my gut at the early part of the game, like a lot of what that means is like things you're like unconsciously intuiting about the system and don't have to like apply a lot of intentional thought to. And I think like for me, I was like, I have to like apply a lot of intentional thought to these things, and I find that annoying.
Totally.
Yeah.
Though, you are pretty good at tactical card games like Rift Force. So I see what you're saying though.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's the games where we're able to do more or less, those tempo considerations. Maybe that's where I slightly have the edge. But Jake, what if we decide if we cover a Reiner Knizia game or a Stefan Feld game next on the show, decided by the winner of our next game of Point Salad? I'm just kidding because
this feels unfair. I am due for a win though,
Yeah.
one of these times.
Oh, in Point Salad.
Yeah, I'm due.
Yeah.
I'm due. Yeah.
Well, I'll play with you as long as you'd like.
All right, let's play again.
Y'all, we have to go play Point Salad, but I hope that this has been an enjoyable episode of Decision Space. Talked a little bit about flat out games, about unbound and bound probabilities in card games. I think that concept also applies beyond card games if you want to really squeeze the juice out of that one. And coming up, we're going to cover Rajas of the Ganges and other exciting things on Decision Space. So come back for more episodes. And if you want more right now, there's 90 episodes. Go listen to them or re-listen.
The countdown to episode 100 is on. Hope y'all are with us for the journey. Thanks so much if you're a new listener. We've had a bunch of new listeners since the Jamie Stegmaier waning Decision Space games. Grateful to have you here with us. And yeah, we will see you next week.
As always, thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song. And also, you could support it, Decision Space, on Patreon. Go to decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon. And for the price of Point Salad, you could support Decision Space for like 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Help us out. Buy us some salad.
Yeah, I'll stop sort of saying that's a better investment.
I think you just said it. Have a good week, y'all.
Bye.